Hello, and welcome to Correspondence for a Cause, the Humanitarian letter writing campaigns in Paul Standard's archive. This archive is held by the Carey Graphic Arts Collection at Rochester Institute of Technology in Rochester, New York. My name is Amelia Fontanelle. I'm a curator here, specializing in typography, graphic design, and the book arts. The archive at hand is the Paul Standard papers that came to RIT in the early 1990s from Mr. Standard himself. The collection contains correspondence, photographs, writings, Mr. Standard's own calligraphy and design projects, as well as his teaching materials, and many different printed matters, including a wide selection of fine press and vintage books. Mr. Standard's day job for 20 years was as the press representative of the Canadian Pacific Railway from its offices on Madison Avenue in Manhattan. But his true passion was anything having to do with calligraphy, design, and book history. He was active in like-minded New York circles with memberships in the Typophiles Group, the Grolier Club Private Library, the American Institute of Graphic Arts, and later 20th century associations like the New York Art Directors and Type Directors Club. Mr. Standard was the prolific author of many articles and books on the history of calligraphic writing, extolling the merits of its modern usage. And he was an accomplished practicing graphic designer and calligrapher in his own right. In his book, Calligraphy's Flowering, Decay, and Restoration, he points out to the general audience that exemplary calligraphic work was a desirable feature in mid-century book trade, especially on book jackets. He stated then in 1947, "Our leading book artists have given new life to the bookshelves and have brought the plain reader to a sense of participation therein. This plain reader may not fully know what has happened to the outward look of books. He only knows they are livelier and friendlier." I find this particularly refreshing from the long view over 70 years later, as hand lettering and calligraphy make a resurgence in contemporary graphic and typeface design, especially in trade book editions. And Paul Standard's December 1947 article in the very popular Women's Day magazine, entitled Our Handwriting, was a plenary urging the best way to correct the tendency for sloppy writing was to adopt Ludovico degli Arrighi's 16th century writing manual for chancery cursive with a flat-nibbed pen. The article was a great success as a practical how-to guide to learn the Chancery cursive script. Standard reissued the article in booklet form and translated it into Dutch, Swedish, and German. Now, getting back to the archive at RIT, Mr. Standard's correspondence takes up some 57 boxes alone, and that's only the letters he had received from hundreds of colleagues and friends. This correspondence provides the primary source basis for this lecture, because in it we find the evidence of an altruistic man whose life was regulated by two constants, a devotion to calligraphy and a loyalty to friends, as my predecessor at the Carey, David Pankow, stated here. I will provide 3 case studies where Standard's pen, and many times his typewriter, made all the difference in the world to the recipients of his letters. The first case study starts on the brink of World War II in the late 1930s and early 40s. Paul Standard came to the aid of Bertold Wolpe, a German typographer of Jewish heritage who had emigrated to London to escape the German nationalist government. Bertold Wolpe went to art school in Frankfurt and Offenbach, Germany. He connected with Stanley Morrison of the Monotype Type Foundry in London, and in 1932 released his typeface Albertus through them. It became so popular in book and sign typography that even some London street signs were set in Albertus, as we see on the left. Wolpe, his mother, and his sister Hilde, all German nationals, emigrated together to London in 1936. Here we see a translated reference letter from a fellow professor in Frankfurt who is confirming Wolpe's teaching skills in calligraphy, concluding that Wolpe was in good standing and only left because of, and I quote, the Nazi ban on non-Aryan teachers. By 1940, having lived in England for 4 years, Bertold Wolpe was interned by the British government, as his German nationality officially deemed him as an enemy alien. He was sent to Australia. In August 1940, Wolpe's sister frantically wrote Paul Standard on her brother's suggestion, as they had several colleagues in common in the publishing trade. She pleaded that he will be very grateful for all of your efforts on his behalf, finding an occupation for him in the United States. When Standard finally was able to ascertain the correct mailing address of Wolpe in Sydney, they began to correspond in earnest with plans for Standard to help Wolpe emigrate to the United States. Paul Standard first tried in vain to get Wolpe a post in teaching at Yale University, but then he settled on a plan to secure American reference letters testifying to Wolpe's teaching and design talents. During this time, Paul Standard sent trade magazines so that his friend could at least keep up with his profession while in custody. And we see at the bottom of that letter there, Wolpe is thanking him for the promise of periodicals, which he is eagerly looking forward to. Through spring 1941, Standard asked publishers and academics to write these letters of emigration support. Here we see a note referring to support from Ray Nash, the esteemed graphic arts professor from Dartmouth College, and another thanking Saul Hess, the head of the Lanston Monotype Type Foundry. A short passage here speaks to Paul Standard's moral character. He wrote, and I quote, "It's true that I do not know Wolpe personally, but have only been an admirer of his work for a great many years past. And yet, when in his extremity, he must appeal for help to a stranger, the stranger somehow could not be a heel enough to refuse." With some delays in communication over air routes, Standard received this letter dated April 18, 1941, where Wolpe reported his release had been authorized, but I quote him, "There is little likelihood that I may be transported back to England because of lack of shipping. Therefore, it has become of the utmost importance for me to try to come to the U.S. if it is not too late." He continued by asking outright, "Do you think you can possibly let me have an affidavit, either of your own or of a friend?" And in the records of Paul Standard's papers at RIT, on May 25, 1941, Standard himself provided such a court-approved financial affidavit, guaranteeing sponsorship of Bertold Wolpe as a refugee immigrant to the United States. These selfless efforts came to a happy end by December 1941, when Paul Standard received a letter from Margaret Wolpe, who was Bertold's new British wife with whom he had been engaged before the detention. I quote from Mrs. Wolpe, "This letter comes to you very humbly and with a sense of great guilt, because Bertold arrived home on August 7th, and your amazingly noble packet of affidavits came some weeks later. Since Bertold arrived home, he has been kept extremely busy, first finding a job, which he has done most successfully with Faber and Faber, although after the pains you have taken, I believe he feels quite ashamed to remain and work in England. And secondly, marrying me and moving into the studio here." Mrs. Wolpe went on, "Bertold is trying to figure out some way in which he can repay the kindness of all the institutions whose help you enlisted by printing for something for them. It is unclear in the Paul Standard Archive if this special edition of Bertold Wolpe prints was sent. But he and his wife, Margaret, lived long, creative lives that eventually merited companion monographs by Impress Editions, published just recently. Incidentally, Bertold Wolpe left an indelible mark on British trade paperback publishing as the art director for Faber and Faber from 1941 through 1982. Let's move on to the next study. Paul Standard, as one so dedicated to the practice of calligraphy, repeatedly cited Edward Johnston as a major influence in reviving calligraphy in the early 20th century. Johnston is best known today as the designer of the sans serif typeface that was used in the London Underground from when it was commissioned in about 1913 through the 1980s. This typeface has since been revived several times in digital font formats. But Johnston's 1906 book, entitled Writing, Illuminating, and Lettering, advanced the merits of a round calligraphic handwriting style made with the broad-edged pen. He educated many in what he called his foundational hand at the Royal College of Art for over 4 decades. Throughout his life, Johnston was a frail man, but in his old age, his sight declined and he found himself on the brink of destitution. This was in 1943 when the United Kingdom had been at war for 4 years and the United States in turn had been active in World War II for just 2 years. In September 1943, Britain's National Society of Art Masters, an art teaching guild, issued a fund appeal for Edward Johnston, age 71 years in his poorly state. It declared here, all of whom owe so much to his teaching and pioneer work are asked to help. And this is where the letter writing campaign was activated. A woman named Margaret Holden Jones, a former British pupil of Johnston's, alerted American Ernst Detterer, another former Johnston pupil. Detterer was then the custodian of the History of Printing collection of the Newberry Library in Chicago. Detterer, in turn, wrote to Paul Standard, who marshaled his wide network with a barrage of letters. Here we see Paul's typescript appeal letter addressed to all calligraphiles. In all, Paul Standard raised $1,518 from 120 contributions. Ernst Detterer, for his part, garnered $125 from 24 American donors to this Edward Johnston Fund. In contemporary money, this is equivalent to over $20,000. The contributors included a who's who of the American typographic, scholarly, and book publishing fields. Some notable donors included publishing presidents like Alfred A. Knopf, Harry N. Abrams, and Bennett Cerf of Random House. Others included publication designers T.M. Cleland and George Salter, as well as the type designers William Addison Dwiggins, Frederick W. Gowdy, Bruce Rogers, and Victor Hammer. And finally, noted scholars also donated, like Philip Hofer at Harvard. Many of those who were creative professionals as donors also practiced calligraphy and lettering, and they were influenced certainly by Johnston's legacy. On January 20th, 1944, a telegram with funds was sent to Edward Johnston with the instructions, "Accept a belated Christmas gift with warm greetings from some American friends. Belated New Year's greetings with their names will follow, from Paul Standard and Ernst Detterer." A few months later, on April 7th, 1944, Johnston responded by cable. "Many thanks. Cables, check, letters, list. Letter follows, Edward Johnston." On April 26, 1944, Johnston started the letter that would become one of Paul Standard's most prized possessions. This was 8 pages in quarto format, written on a board on Johnston's lap while he was bedridden. His exuberant thank you note incorporates large letters and a handwriting style adapted from the 10th century Ramsay Psalter in the British Museum, which Johnston had studied as a young man. The collected funds brought an end to Johnston's financial worries. He passed just 7 months after writing this masterpiece of a letter. In Paul Standard's lifetime, he always wanted to publish the letter in facsimile at original size, but he never managed to convince a publisher to undertake the book on the subject. Johnston did give his permission to do so before he passed, and we see another cable saying, "Suggest facsimile booklet, same size paper." After Paul Standard's collection came to RIT, then curator David Pankow fulfilled his longtime wish by publishing the book entitled Thinking in Script, a letter of thanks from Edward Johnston to Paul Standard. This was in 1995. The amazing thank you letter by Johnston is published in facsimile along with a transcription and excerpts from the exchanges with the donors. In this spread of the letter, we see that Johnston is ever the teacher, analyzing the qualities of his letter-form shapes. Paul Standard did, of course, manage to commemorate Edward Johnston after he passed in his own book called Calligraphy's Flowering, Decay, and Restoration, with several thoughtful tributes, including this one on the very first page. More than a reviver, Johnston was the great exemplar of modern calligraphy, the link between all scribes, living and departed. In this last chapter of my talk, after World War II, Paul Standard's reach also extended beyond the Iron Curtain, as he corresponded with the era's leading Czech type designer, a fellow named Aldrich Menhart, from 1946 until Menhart's death in 1962. Aldrich Menhart had lived in Western Europe in the 1930s and had success in designing metal typefaces for letterpress printing, such as his Menhart Antiqua, shown here, cast by the German type foundry Bauer in Frankfurt. He returned to Prague through World War II and lived with his wife and daughter, eking out a living as a teacher and a type designer. These are several exemplary designs revived of his typefaces in digital form, all of which exhibit strong influence of calligraphic traditions on typographic letter forms, an interest that he shared with Paul Standard. They had some German and English friends in common, hence their first introduction by mail, which was always inspected by the Czech government. The two men exchanged frequent critiques about each other's work, especially Menhart's type designs and the state of design in the Western world. At first, their correspondence was formal as colleagues, but it grew into even a family friendship. And he says here, "When I take leave of this world one day, the remembrance of you will shine on in my journey into darkness." Standard was an absolute lifeline for Menhart, sending him books and articles from the West when the Czech government was limiting communication. Here Menhart thanks Standard heartily for coffee and vermilion pigments, which, I quote, "made the weekday seem a holiday, and I don't doubt that these are the best things as they come from the best heart I know beyond the ocean." Menhart also bemoaned the non-existence of private publishers in post-war Czechoslovakia in that third paragraph of this letter from 1949. In this letter, we see Menhart's summary of modern Czech typography, calling out the contemporary practitioners so Standard may become familiar with the typographic and design culture. In fact, Menhart pens a wonderful boast. The latter discontinued their attempts to create printing types only after realizing that they could not achieve more in this field than I had. Something truly extraordinary that survives in the Paul Standard papers was discovered by a colleague looking to digitize and revive some Menhart typefaces. Aldrich Menhart had sent this silent 8mm film in a craft paper envelope to his friend Paul Standard in the 1950s, We were able to have the film digitized at RIT, and here he is in moving pictures from over 70 years ago, Mr. Aldrich Menhart. And it starts with some landscaped. It looks like people that are enjoying a picnic in the Czech countryside outside of Prague. And it quickly will move to Mr. Menhart at his desk examining a medal that he received for his accomplishments as a designer. Then we see a little bit of his workspace. After this short break as a splice in the film, there is an image of Menhart and his wife, whom had become friendly as Mrs. Standard also sent cookbooks and different kinds of foodstuffs to Mrs. Menhart. And the final bit of this clip shows Aldrich Menhart at work. He's completing the lettering that will be published on the cover of a book of poems. I'm just fascinated that this media survived the trip at the height of the Cold War. On a recent trip myself to Prague, some Czech colleagues suggested that it was purposeful that the media was sent to New York intact and uncensored. It was kind of like an informal reaffirmation from the authorities of the time that life under the communist rule was just as rich as in the West. At the end of his life, Aldrich Menhart paid tribute to his grand friendship by naming a typeface after Paul Standard. And here we see a serif typeface named Standard, published by the Czech type foundry Grafotechna. In his last letter in the collection dated August 18, 1961, Menhart was too frail to write in his typically expressive handwriting, and instead typed his farewell. Two old people, and that is Mr. and Mrs. Menhart, beneath the Prague castle remember you and Madame Stella very often. You brought joy, encouragement, and understanding to their lives during these long years, and it was not in vain. Without this fertilizing dew, my work would not have matured. For all this, we feel great, deep gratitude and send you our best wishes and warm greetings. Seemingly prescient of the importance of the correspondence, Paul Standard's letters to Aldrich Menhart were microfilmed and archived in the Prague National Museum after Menhart's death in 1962. And in turn, Standard sent copies of Menhart's letters to Prague for completion. Here we see the envelope that carried the microfilm. I want to close this talk with one last hopeful quote from Aldrich Menhart. I share with you the belief that there will come a time when there will be more and better possibilities for calligraphers and typographers devoted to their fine work, to interchange their experiences. And of course, we humans of the 21st century know that easy creative sharing and commentary has come to pass with the instancy of electronic communication through email and social media. But increasingly, those digital efforts of exchange are slipping away in the maelstrom of over-communication and weak digital preservation. And that is why archival records, like the Paul Standards collection, matter so very much. For through them, we see people demonstrating true empathy for their peers, like Paul Standard did for Bertold Wolpe, Edward Johnston, and Aldrich Menhart. He went absolutely beyond collegiality and turned care into meaningful action. Thank you so much for listening to this talk. I invite you to contact me at the RIT Cary Graphic Arts Collection as we are open to external researchers. Thank you.